Good morning to all. Let me begin by thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to present this paper. My paper, Escaping the Regulatory Grille, Understanding the Taxonomy of Power and Responsibilities of Global Conglomerates, is a work in progress and provides a perspective on global regulatory matrix. The paper essentially seeks to capture the opaque relationship between the corporate, state, and regulatory institutions. It also tries to open the black box of business-state relations and as it attempts to understand the implications of various institutional arrangements. The paper further disaggregates the unfolding topologies of governance. The core idea being put forward here is that emerging regulatory reconfiguration is a cumulative product of unstructured initiatives that coincide equally with powerful countervailing forces in global sphere. The important starting point in understanding the politics of corporate accountability is a recognition that as corporates assume both more overt presence in the public domain and take on functions hitherto associated with the state, their role as political actor is greater than before, and they have become legitimate targets of contestation. One effect of corporatization of capitalism is that many perceive global conglomerates as highly implicated in global injustice. David Levi emphasized that to better understand the regulation, we need to pay closer attention to certain quintessential questions. First, he says, who are the regulators? What is being regulated? And then he adds a very important or a vital supplementary questions. Who benefits from these regulations? All these questions defy tidy theorizing. Conceptual as well as taxonomic contributions have now started to recognize the significance of actor constellations engaged in governance field and have sought to buck the rigid hierarchical and state centricism. The complex interaction of these vectors determine who is given voice, authority, and legitimacy within the intricate network of organizational forms in an overarching regulatory regime. Now, the regulatory responses to globalization throws open certain fault lines and blind spots. Turbulent events in the world food, financial, and energy markets, worldwide slump, exigencies in the climate change, the explicit character of corporate greed, and series of high-profile cases involving corporate crime, rising inequality implies that various characteristics of globalization and economic liberalization are fundamentally inconsistent. Along with these, there are other dimensions of distributional injustices, namely the gross inequities in the distribution of value within the global commodity and supply chain, abusive practices, low propensity for employment generation, casualization of labor, and also the privatization of basic public services partly explains the curious paradox of how 3 decades of globalization and growth of foreign direct investment have actually resulted in chronic north-south disparities and imbalances which has only got aggravated in the last few decades. Just how substantial a gap there is in the regulatory agenda has become strikingly clear in the context of the current financial crisis, where issues of regulatory arbitrage, exorbitant pay packages to the executive, despite company losses, tax evasions, as well as the relationship between the debt-driven consumption model have come to the forefront. Now, the race to the bottom is a common theme in globalization literature and is a part of a reality of globalization, that competition for investment can include auctions of less costly regulatory standards. And there's nothing intrinsic in the design of the bottom of pyramid approach to ensure that the globalization will establish businesses that respect economic, environmental, and social considerations of all the stakeholders equally. We also need to remember that the current global regime did not result spontaneously, but required strings of calculated, intended social, economic, and political interventions mediated through the iron fist of the state, often in velvet glove, and invisible handshakes that were placed under the broader rubric of LPG, liberalization, globalization, and privatization. Now this is a map which clearly shows the supply chain of a production of a company, that is Dell Computers. And if you look into the map, this was an example which was taken by Thomas Friedman, and it is also known as Dell theory of interconnectedness, and explains the level of integration in global production. A company which is there in Texas has its products being produced from Mexico, France, China, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. So the internal relocation of the company's manufacturing and other processes to a foreign land is to take advantage of the less costly operations there. Countries like Malaysia, India, Mexico, Brazil must compete with China and among each other to have businesses offshore to them. So today, countries do not really trade with each other, corporations do. And what is interesting is that as much as 40% of the global trade is intra-firm trade, that is commerce between multinational corporations, cross-border affiliates. MNC's parent companies are now linked with one another in virtual corporations and alliances of co-ownership and co-production. These MNC's virtual networks pursue truly global strategies for financial gain, often through long-term suppliers, agreements, licensing, and franchising. As they funnel large financial flows across the national borders, the global conglomerates are integrating national economies into the worldwide market, and this ultimately leads to convergence or standardization of institutions and practices or governance practices. Now, money or interest-bearing capital generates increasingly fantastic forms of fictitious credit, fictitious capital, and fictitious profits, which have reshaped the wider social formation in many ways. Now, Neil Ferguson, in his 2008, the name of the book is Ascent of Money, gives us an interesting figures just before the financial crisis happened. Now he says that in 2006, the total value of the stock market in the world was $51 trillion. That is 10 times higher than the actual GDP, which stood at $47 trillion. And the total value of all the bonds, domestic and international, was $68 trillion. And $473 trillion of derivatives were bought and sold in 2006. Thus, the debt deleveraging creates a condition of vicious cycle of debt, default, and deflation dynamics. And such expansions and innovations easily slip the regulations, marking the beginning of reckless quest for profit, transgressing limits, failures, panics, and crises. Now, there was an interesting report which came up by Oxfam in February 2014, just before the Davos conference. And the title of the report is Working for Few. And they had some very interesting, or I can say numbing numbers to project. And the report says that almost half of the world's wealth is now owned by just 1% of the population, and that amounts to $110 trillion. That's 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world population. And this report also talks about rigging the system in the favor of the few. And there is a last, the post-crisis wealth generation has been captured by the top 1% of the US rather than being distributed to the larger population out there. So thus globalization has ultimately redistributed an income and wealth towards the have-lots at the expense of not only the have-nots, but also the squeezed middle. That is causing potential resentment between the Wall Street and the Main Street and their equivalents elsewhere in the world. So MNCs have a very interesting institutional story that better fits the condition of equivocality, ambiguity, and complexity. MNCs are themselves political arenas where powerful actors must make sense, manipulate, negotiate, and partially construct the institutional environment. And what is significant is that they just don't respond to the regulative institutional pressures, but actively engage in the transnational standard settings, monitoring and auditing, and sometimes make worse the spatial difference in living and labor standards, healthcare, environment, and human rights indices. Worrisome also is the institution and or regulatory capture for facilitation and legitimization of corporate capitalism. A series of high publicized human and environmental disasters and corporate scandals have raised legitimate questions about corporate accountability. Enron, WorldCom, BP, Shell, Nike, Walmart, Satyam, just to name few, were paragons of corporate best until they all collapsed under the weight of greed, hubris, and criminality. So yes, capitalism is not self-stabilizing. It is a socially embedded, socially regularized ensemble of economic activities, organizations, and institutions that combine to give a distinctive dynamics to specific capitalism in distinctive times and places, what is termed as varieties of capitalism or path dependency. On the changing balance between the reproduction secured by market mechanism and regulation and regularization as secured through non-market mechanism, regulationists emphasize a historically contingent economic and extra-economic needs, specific economic agents to act in specific circumstances in accordance with unevenly changing objective requirements of capitalist reproduction. Thereby, the regulatory approach analysis framed by agencies can be defined as an accumulation regime plus its mode of production or regulation, and its dynamics can be measured in terms of self-valorization of capital in and through regulation. Thus, the regulationists replace both the idea of general equilibrium and an analysis of static equilibrium with an investigation of dynamic process of reabsorption of disequilibria constantly caused by accumulation. Yeah, so regulations are fundamentally, what are regulations for? Regulations are fundamentally designed to force corporates to internalize or pay for the cost they would otherwise externalize or load off onto the society or environment. Galbraith brings in the concept of countervailing powers of other institutions to offset the corporate power and ensure that abuses are curbed. George Gilligan uses the multilateral framework and allows us to understand how gatekeepers emerge, operate in particular, and adapt strategies and structures, but also act as window on some of the key political determinants in the contemporary governance praxis. The curious common characteristics of all the regulatory arrangements and agreements is, for example, the Kimberley process or UN Global Compact or Ruge's Principle of Human Rights, ILO tripartite agreements or OECD guidelines for transnational corporations are, this is common for all the guidelines, they are voluntary or they are self-regulations beyond compliance. And market regulation, therefore, has become an endogenic concept of market process. Self-regulation by corporates thus has been interpreted by many as self-interested behavior to acquire the public square. So as we know, the network governance means a shift in both the public and the private sector from Fordist control of systematically specialized, broken down production system to a post-Fordist steering of more volatile system that are partially contracted out and partly contracted in to shifting collaborative groups that compete for growth with both insiders and outsiders. Ronan Schimmer, on his book which was published in 2010 on corporate social responsibility, elucidates how mechanism to regulate and ensure compliance with legal or quasi-legal arrangements have shifted from formal rules and stipulations, adversarial methods, enforceable means of dispute resolution, and command and control regulatory mechanism to non-adversarial dialogues, organizational learning, presumably leading to development of principles, guidelines, best performance standards, and various soft law instrumentalities. Given the fact that neither public nor private meta-governance has been able to orchestrate the effective use of different types of regulation on a grand scale, the governance playing field sketched here is clearly a cumulative product of countless, more or less spontaneous initiatives that have been developed by varieties of actor constellations. So the fragmentation of the steering and lack of orchestration can pragmatically be regarded as an opportunity that has opened up the door for multiple routes of interventions, as you can see it in the slide, through which what is happening is that many actors are engaging in polycentric governance. As shown in the figure, the hard governmental deregulation are now accompanied by soft or hybridized governmental regulation on one hand and societal re-regulation or co-regulation or tripartite agreements on the other hand. Today, many global governors operate in a space between the thin state consent and thick stakeholder consensus. This figure also depicts a hierarchical relationship between the state and corporates is getting displaced by an idea of multiple parallel spaces in which power is encountered and negotiated. It is termed as unstructured complexity. It stresses on the complementary functions of wide variety of other mechanisms in structuring, facilitating, and regularizing accumulation. The examples of the tripartite co-regulation could be global reporting initiatives, UN principles of responsible investment, ISO 26 guidelines for social responsibility, to name few. Now this is another figure, and a look at this slide further illustrates how the resulting policy transforms existing power geometrics, resulting in new constellation of power governance articulated via proliferating maze of opaque networks, fuzzy institutional arrangements, ill-defined responsibilities, and ambiguous political objectives and priorities. Such an unmitigated embeddedness concept, which amalgates the role of agency, multidimensional institutions, and co-evolution of individual and corporate actors and structures, opens up the broader understanding of MNCs and their governance praxis. Thus, corporates accept to, adapt to, and capitalize on the institutional, cultural, and market heterogeneity while simultaneously trying to capture economies associated with leveraging some kind of a scalable advantage in certain assets or processes it owns or is currently developing. This can also be understood as heteroarchy as opposed to hierarchy, which is far more interdependent and interlinked to various hubs and nodes. So this, the state in this complex cosmology, a term used by Phil Cherny, needs to recast itself so that instead of operating awkwardly upon the heteroarchical processes, state wields more responsively and reflexively in something akin to what Julia Black calls post-regulatory regulation of self-regulation, which results in diffused reciprocity. The elements of poly-centered governance pattern can thus be soft forms of governance at arm's length, like informing, providing guidelines, approving or disapproving, appealing to corporates, etc. Or it can be governance in the shadow of hierarchy, in the hard form in which government threatens co- and self-regulators with harder laws in case they fail to meet minimum benchmarks. Now, the term cis-regulatory elements has been taken from biology, and it basically means that it's present in the same molecule of a DNA as the gene they regulate, right? So the most well-characterized type of cis-regulatory elements are self-enhancers, are promoters, genetically. I'm talking about the genetic level here, not about the corporates. So conversely, if you juxtapose these emerging typologies of governance, arrangements, vis-a-vis the CRE or cis-regulatory elements, it resembled an edifice of post-Washington consensus or augmented Washington consensus. Now, the point here is that what exactly is post-Washington consensus? Whereas the earlier Washington consensus sought to unleash market forces to straight-jacketed policies, prescriptions, and privatization and liberalization, post-Washington consensus takes a qualitatively different approach. This is the last slide, okay? In contrast to the bare-knuckle neoliberalism, post-Washington consensus believes in consultation with stakeholders. In a sense, the core purpose of the government here is to continue in the broader scheme of extending competitive market in a ways that circumvent the implementation impediments and the crisis of legitimacy that market-led development is currently encountering. It embodies a recognition that establishing liberal market is essentially a political project. Political technologies evident in the arrangements like partnership and processes of participation, social capital, co- and self-regulation attempt to harness the support of corporate agenda beneath the veneer of inclusiveness and pluralism. Through such arrangements, namely shared values, agreed standards, partnerships, corporates have skillfully opened up or accessed more areas for reshaping regulatory processes. The concept of corporate citizenships, eco and social labeling, green markets, PPPs are political technologies being entailed both as an agenda-setting role and promoting processes which provide a glossy clothing to legitimacy of extension of the market society. In a similar vein or in similar fashion, the so-called autopoietic systems of organization are said to adapt through self-regulating mechanism which ensures that change largely on their own terms in unity and resist external interventions. Some argue that corporates now embody both the characteristics of CRE and autopoietic institutions because they want to do the self-preservation through reworked copy in a highly discredited and confronted corporate times. So, however, this is the last paragraph. So, however, the triumphs of the proclamation of the well-crafted post-Washington consensus and augmented Washington consensus are still racked. Self-regulation and co-regulation have not really checked the power of big capital. Campaigns for transparency, participation, and sustainability have not made corporates any more accountable, equitable, or just. My last line is that I would quote from Carl Polanyi, where he says that instead of economy being embedded in social relations are embedded in economic system. And once market gets disembedded from society, corporates impose massive social, economic, and environmental. Use the Dell model to